Hi, welcome to Album Soup, where we talk about the ingredients, influences, and genres that go into making a particular album. In this particular episode, we're going to be talking about Imaginal Disk by Magdalena Bay. This album is only about a year old at the time of this recording, and yet it has made a huge splash in the indie circles. It is a pop album at its core, and yet it features so many different influences and styles and motifs from various other genres that I thought it would be very interesting to dissect different ways in which this album is influenced by the likes of prog and vaporwave and everything else in between. The first genre or subgenre that must be discussed when discussing this album is synth pop and dance pop. I don't want to be too particular about synth pop or dance pop or the other pops that I'm talking about here, so this is a very broad and hasty categorization. Magdalena Bay makes synth pop music. They want to be seen as alternative, which I totally respect, but the synth pop elements are very much at the forefront and at the root of their sound, and so I'm going to give some suggestions based on that. First up, ABBA with Arrival. This is a classic album in the pop canon. Dancing Queen is one of the biggest songs ever, honestly, and it's something that Matt said influenced him quite a lot when he was making this album, so I am not at all surprised that the band is into ABBA, and I think this album is a very good place to start to hear some really classic and fun and danceable pop music. Next up, Kylie Minogue with Fever. Now we're jumping forward a couple of decades. Yet again, we have a fun, high-energy dance pop album with track after track of fun music. Certainly not the same thing as ABBA, and in fact, Kylie Minogue on this album pulls from a lot of different pop sounds too. There's some disco stuff, there's some techno stuff, there's lots of stuff going on, and Magdalena Bay said they really like her, and I'm not surprised at all. Next up, I have an album that might not traditionally fall into this category, but I think it fits anyway, Charlie XCX, How I'm Feeling Now. Magdalena Bay have been influenced by Charlie XCX, and in fact, I believe that they've toured with her. This album has a lot of maximalist and blown-out production, just like Imaginal Disk has, and I think both albums share a bedroom aesthetic. How I'm Feeling Now was made during quarantine and really feels like a quarantine album from 2020, one of the defining artistic statements of that period in our collective history. And Imaginal Disk, while not quite as bedroomy as earlier Magdalena Bay stuff, still kind of pays homage to her, is very rooted in, at-home videos and, simpler stuff like that. They're not trying to impress you with all these studio bells and whistles so much as they are really interesting ideas. My last album for this category is Yellow Magic Orchestra with their self-titled debut album. These guys from Japan have made a massive impact on electronic music and techno pop. Magdalena Bay said that they really like them, and I'm not surprised at all. I don't think that this is their easiest project to get into, and probably wouldn't be my starting point. You might want to go to Solid State Survivor for that, but it's still really fun, really interesting, and I definitely give it a listen. Yellow Magic Orchestra might be an acquired taste. It's one that you need to put in some time to get into, but is worth it. Okay, moving on now, I'm going to talk about some art pop albums. Art pop is not really so much of a style as it is a attitude, I suppose, towards making music. People who make art pop are making music for artistic reasons to express something, not just for entertainment. And while I don't think that Imaginal Disk is necessarily sonically that similar to the albums I'm going to be discussing, it certainly is making a statement, has a lot going on artistically, thematically, and everything. And so I think that these albums are very much worth talking about when discussing Imaginal Disk's influences. So first up, I'm talking about Björk with Post. Björk is possibly the biggest, kind of most revered figure in art pop, so talking about her seems necessary. And the reason I chose Post as the album to represent her is because I think it's the most similar to what Imaginal Disk is like. This album has a lot of electronic stuff going on. It's kind of trip-hoppy as well, and yet it still has a lot of random weird stuff thrown in there, a couple like cabaret songs and stuff. So super creative album. I definitely think that if you like Imaginal Disk, it's worth checking out. Next up, I have Fiona Apple with When the Pawn. Fiona Apple is a vocalist that has influenced Mika's singing. She's also a very big art pop artist, although her sound is super different from Magdalena Bay or from Björk. I think this album is a bit more song focused. There's not so much weirdness, but it's still very interesting. I think that there's a lot of jazz going on. The rhythm section is really impressive, and the songwriting comes through as well. So this album is very much worth your time. My next recommendation is Chairlift with Moth. These guys originally wanted to make music for haunted houses, and I think that's something Magdalena Bay would be at least intrigued by. I think they've toured with Caroline Polachek as well, who was one of the two members of this duo and probably is more well known for her solo work now than this duo. And yet, I think this album is something that Magdalena Bay shares creative space with because it's catchy and fun and poppy, but it's also weird at times. They're not afraid to be a little kooky and stuff. So you'll probably like this one if you like Imaginal Disk. Last up, Grimes with Miss Anthropocene. Grimes is a very clear influence on Magdalena Bay. They've in fact made a remix of Image with her. It definitely has a different kind of sound palette than Imaginal Disc does. It's a little bit more industrial. It's more, well, it's darker, I suppose. Even if the lyrics on Imaginal Disc get kind of dark, the sound doesn't that much. I also think Mika takes a bit after Grimes' singing style. So this is definitely an album kind of in the same general creative area. Next up, I'm talking about prog rock. You might be surprised to hear this because this album doesn't really sound prog like it does sound synth pop. At the same time, Matt and Mika were in a prog duo before they formed Magdalena Bay, and I think that the prog influences that, clearly have been things that they've been listening to for a long time, do show up from time to time in tracks like Tunnel Vision especially, but also are just kind of lurking in the background and also make up a large part of their artistic identity and process of making music. My first album recommendation is Genesis with Selling England by the Pound. Genesis appears to be Matt and Mika's favorite prog band. They talk about them a lot. They really admire the whimsical energy that this era of Genesis's career, the Peter Gabriel era, really put out on a bunch of albums. This is probably my favorite album of this era of Genesis, and I definitely think that if you want to get into classic prog and don't mind a bit of silliness and are willing to kind of suspend some disbelief, this album is definitely worth your time. Next up, Yes with Close to the Edge. This album has an epic, symphonic opening track, which is the title track and is like 20 minutes long. And yet it's so beautiful. It has a lot of different movements. It doesn't really get into indulgence, or it doesn't really get into excess like a lot of prog does. In fact, Matt said, and I agree, that Yes, on some of their other albums, do kind of jump the shark and go overboard. But this album is not that, even with such a long track. It's really beautiful. It's a prog classic without a doubt. Next up, ELP with Pictures at an Exhibition. Now, this album is really creative. Matt said it influenced him a lot growing up. The band took a classical piece and adapted it for prog, and it's a live album at the same time. So very, very heady, very artsy. I admire it a lot, even if it's not my favorite on this list. And if you're more interested in deeper cuts in prog, since the other ones I'm talking about are pretty mainstream and celebrated already, check this out. My last prog recommendation is possibly the most famous prog album ever. This is Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, an album that I think fully lives up to the hype that's been bestowed on it over the years. I think it has a lot of sci-fi stuff going on, which is why it's the Pink Floyd album I chose for this list, just like Imaginal Disk does. Both of them have themes of alienation and existence and all that. Plus, it's not self-indulgent at all. I don't think there's a single track that runs over 8 minutes, something like that. It's song-based, and man, they wrote some really catchy songs while also having some really innovative musical and lyrical and production ideas. So definitely give this a listen. Next up, I'm talking about art rock, which, like art pop, isn't very well defined, so I'm not going to really try that hard. This is just rock music that was made in the 60s through 90s, so I'm really jumping a wide time frame here, that clearly had statements to make and had a lot of bold, innovative things going on. Ironically, prog is possibly the most artsy of rock, and yet this is kind of just an umbrella category to distinguish rock that isn't really prog. First up, I have the Beatles with Magical Mystery Tour. The band got weird on this one. They've been weird before and after, but I think this was their weirdest. Pairing Strawberry Fields Forever and I Am the Walrus on the same album is a very bold choice, but it somehow works. I know that Matt and Mika really like the Beatles, and I would be not surprised at all if this was an album that they really came back to or really were interested in, just given it has that zany stuff going on. Next up, I have David Bowie with The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, one of the most celebrated glam rock albums ever, one of the most celebrated David Bowie albums ever, and it really lives up to the hype as well. It's also got a bit of a spacey, sci-fi, whatever going on too, but you don't really need to follow the story or the concept to just admire the songwriting and the performances. It's great. Next up, I have the Electric Light Orchestra with Time. This is honestly the closest I've heard rock sound to Magdalena Bay. These guys are pretty proggy, to be fair, and almost could have been in the prog category, but I put them here just because there's still a lot of pop going on. It's almost like progressive pop rather than progressive rock. Um, it's got a lot of bleep bloop stuff too. I hadn't listened to this before I started doing this research, but I'm really happy I have now. Last up, I have Radiohead with OK Computer, another classic in the rock canon, and while possibly not Radiohead's best, I'm not really going to get into the debate. Probably the album that is most songwriting focused, I think. There's not quite as much stuff going on in terms of production or experimentation or whatever. It's just really, really great alternative rock, and I chose it because of the sci-fi themes too. My next category of music or genre is utopian virtual, which is a subgenre of vaporwave. This is not something I've heard people talking about when they talk about Imaginal Disk or Magdalena Bay, but I really think people should talk about it. This is a genre that really embraces kitschy nostalgia for the early 2000s, especially in terms of like digital media and aesthetics and all that. At times, the irony isn't always apparent. Like, are they actually nostalgic for this stuff, or is it, a play? It's not always easy to tell. Magdalena Bay certainly has that irony to them. Some of these albums that I'm going to discuss are more satirical than others, but they're all interesting and they're all worth checking out, especially if you like tracks like True Blue. First up, Eyeliner with Drop Shadow. This album is the most sonically diverse on here. There's a lot of different stuff going on. There's the Fruiter Arrow neo ambient stuff to like basically synth pop stuff, and yet it all somehow fits together on the same project. It's really fun, and I do recommend it. Next up, James Ferraro, Far Side Virtual. This is a very important album in the vaporwave canon, and honestly, saying vaporwave canon makes me feel ridiculous. Nonetheless, James Ferraro is a really innovative and interesting artist. This was a big pivot away from his lo-fi stuff, and instead he made an album full of literal ringtones. It's not my favorite of his to listen to, but I do think it's a very quintessential utopian virtual album that should definitely be listened to once by people interested in the genre. Next up, Explosi with Raflesia Online. This project has drums on it, which kind of took me off guard. I'm not used to hearing that in vaporwave, and it's a bit more electronic, and it's got a bit more of that corporate stuff going on because it's a little bit more upbeat than some of these other projects. I'm not always sure that the corporate aesthetics are satirical, but it's fun and it's short and sweet and worth checking out for a fan of utopian virtual music. My last album for this genre is Satin Sheets with St. Francis 2. This is my favorite album in this utopian virtual selection that I've given you, probably because it's a lot more ambient, and in vaporwave I'm usually drawn more towards the ambient stuff. I think that the fact that there's a CD on the album cover should be an indication that this and Imaginal Disk have some creative chemistry. I honestly have no idea if Magdalena Bay listened to vaporwave or know anything about this stuff. So this is less about what influenced them and more what you as a listener might enjoy if you like them. Just my 2 cents, just want to be honest there. Okay, now just a few personal picks, not necessarily fitting into any category, but simply albums I want to talk about that I think have some type of vibe connection with Imaginal Disk and are some of my favorite that I'm talking about today. First up, I have George Clanton with Slide. George Clanton is a big artist in the vaporwave world. I almost included him in the utopian virtual section, but I went with this album because it's still a pop album. It just has a lot of vaporwave stuff kind of going on, and so if you like the vaporwave aspects of Imaginal Disk, you will really like this album. I highly recommend. Next up, I have Caro Caro Bonito with Bonito Generation. I feel like this is a very superficial comparison. It's one that people might make kind of instinctively. These two groups don't really sound that similar in my opinion, but I still think that they belong in the same category, or at least belong in the same conversation. They both make really catchy and fun, but quirky electronic pop, and I think that if you like one group, you'll almost certainly like the other. My next pick is Hemlock Springs with Going, Going, Gone. Hemlock is very new in her career. She's only released a couple of projects, and that reminds me of Matt and Mika and Magdalena Bay when they were earlier in their career and before they kind of made this high concept masterpiece of an album. So I'm really excited to see where Hemlock Springs goes from here, because she also has a lot of that 80s synth pop stuff. She also has some nostalgia and some, ironic stuff going on. So I really think she has the potential to make a really great album, and I can't wait for that. My last pick is Igor by Tyler, the Creator. I've always thought that Igor and Imaginal Disk have some vibes in common. I was reminded of Igor the first time I ever listened to Imaginal Disk. I think the album's respective final tracks are really similar, both in production style as well as the hopeful message that the narrative ends on. So while they don't necessarily sound that similar, and I'm sure if you've heard of Imaginal Disk, you've heard of Igor, I wonder if anyone else hears this or if it's just me. That is all of my recommendations for now. Thank you so much for watching. Imaginal Disk is a very complex and nuanced album. I recognize that it might not sound like prog at first, and yet I really think this is kind of a very clear example of how musicians often pull from a variety of references and are constantly listening to different things and getting little bits and pieces from all over the place. We as music listeners should also embrace an exploratory and open-minded attitude when we explore new music too.